Can people just Rogers? Could people just put a quick thumbs up on the screen so I know they can hear me? Amazing. All right. So today's going to be about social movements. For those of you who don't know, we'll just give a brief overview about what they are, and then get into some more specific things. So social movements form what we call a collective or unit of action group, which means that they have a degree of organization in them and they have specific goals and strategies for achieving these aims. The notable thing about social movements, the reason we call them social movements, is two reasons. Firstly, they emerge in response to inequality or oppression. So what this means is they concern marginalized groups or groups whose society does not afford as many, let's say, opportunities or as many rights. This manifests itself in a couple of ways, which means there's like a number of groups that fall under this umbrella. We'll get onto those in a second. The second important thing to note about social movements here is what their aims and what their goals are. Because broadly speaking, they have two big aims. One is to get accepted into society. So that's to say that the average person will empathize with what they're doing, will understand what they're doing, will maybe vouch for their movement, will maybe do a bit more. So let's say the environmental movement is a social movement. You would hope that as an environmentalist, what was likely to happen is that the average person will, let's say, recycle more or stop using plastic bottles. So they look for general societal change. The second thing that is important to note is they look for political change. So whenever you're talking about political debates, it's important to think about the incentives and strategies of social movements in how they're going to lobby for change, how they're going to ensure that their issues, that their movement is going to get onto the agenda topics for discussion and debate, is how it's going to get onto policymakers' desks so it actually gets finished. With that in mind, let's move on to some examples. So these are the kind of general big examples that you're likely to come across in debates or when and if you want to talk about them. So very clear ones. Women's suffrage is, the important thing to note before we get on here is that there is what we call a big disparity between social movements in different parts of the world. So as we've been talking about recently in debating, it's often good to have different characterizations of what the world looks like because it's not a monolith. The world has lots of different parts that move at different speeds and paces. That's why we have developing countries versus developed countries, rapidly developing economies versus slowly developing economies. In each of these countries, these movements will look very, very different. So, for example, rather intuitive, rather intuitive, something like women's suffrage, quite advanced in Western nations such as the US, big democracies, the UK, Germany, Japan. Where it is much less advanced is countries such as Central Africa or the Middle East, where traditional practices often infiltrate much more of society, and women's suffrage is still a very big social movement. Likewise, they're often regionally specific. So BLM is a big issue generally and globally. It is also specifically interesting when we talk about the US. So in a US context, it's often very good to talk about Black Lives Matter movement. LGBTQ plus is quite ubiquitous. The feminist movement also operates very ubiquitously. The distinction between the feminist movement and women's suffrage is women's suffrage being able to vote and act as functioning members of society. The feminist movement is affording generally equal rights, such as in the workplace or in gender pay gaps and maternity pay. And then environmentalism, you already know. So at this stage, what you should have is a clear conception of what social movements want to do. They want to change how certain people are treated in society generally, and then they also want to get political change that enshrines this into legislature, which means that there are laws and protectionist policies that ensure that their ideas and what they believe are kept safe by the government. Any questions at this point whatsoever, please shout. I'll wait a few seconds. Brilliant. Okay. At any point, oh yeah, Tashi, please. Yeah.
So it's basically to change the ideas of people. Is that what you said? Or
Exactly.
okay.
So social movements are trying to change how society treats or values certain things. And they do that through these two ways. They try and just change your general action and try and general engagement with the world. So that's how you do things, whether you recycle or not, whether you're likely to treat, let's say, a racial minority well, and secondly, through political means, i.e. through voting in politicians who are likely to treat them well, who are likely to create good policy that does good things for them. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Good. Okay, so yeah, exactly as you said, they're minority groups. They're things that they're trying to change the mind of the people that are going on. As you can tell, not most people are environmentalists. If they were, we wouldn't have an environmental crisis. So their general goals. In broad strokes, they want to do three things. Firstly, they want to represent marginalized people. That's what Tasha was just talking about. It means the majority of the population do not support this idea. Because if they did, these social movements wouldn't exist because there's no reason to change anyone's mind. There's no reason to get better policy. So they are inherently supporting a minority view, or at least come from a minority background. Increasingly, they become the majority view. Something like BLM is a great example of something in the US, especially, where it came from a small minority of people with very little power structures to work within, and then it spread more generally as it became a social phenomenon. Secondly, they want to redistribute wealth and power. And what this means is not only are they marginalized, which means not only are they kind of a small group that is not afforded the same rights, their aim then is to redistribute that wealth and power. It's to ensure that, for example, let's go back to BLM movement, to ensure that black politicians are now black politicians represent black people just as much as white politicians in the US. If you look at the history of politicians, you'll see that is not the case. Clearly, there's a lot of work still to be done. Wealth is also a big one. They are often tend to be, and this is a generalization, but helpful if you want to conceive of it, more left-wing. So they support things like higher taxing on the rich, less on the poor, to ensure that the redistribution of wealth goes smoothly, often quite prominent in post-colonial states. The US is, again, a great example. Thirdly, they want greater access to rights. So this is not talking about systems of structure, systems of power, for example, like tangible wealth and healthcare system. This is about greater access to rights. So what in law protects them from getting hurt, harassed, abused? Because these are the kind of groups that are often subject to marginalization or segregation because of the fact that they are minorities. So, in brief, these are people that are often a small percent of the population with a very big goal of increasing how they are treated. They want to do this through two means: their wealth and power distribution, and also greater access to rights, which means through infrastructure such as like healthcare or general like treatment versus laws that politicians can make. Let's look at some important considerations. At this point, are there any more questions? Please do ask. That's the best way to learn if you're confused. Okay. Please just put your hand up if there is one. That would be great. Okay. Let's look at the problem here then. So social movements, we broadly agree in debating, are good things in the sense that they are supporting people who otherwise would not be protected. They're often groups that we see as vulnerable actors. When we were talking about specific people who we're thinking about in a debate, these are a specific group that often need to be considered because of their vulnerability. What is the problem? A few things. Firstly, not all members agree with each other within a social movement. So there is a diversity of membership, which means that even if they have a common goal generally, these views are often very different about how to achieve that. And there are a variety of subgroups then within each movement. This means two things. So one, within a country, within a specific nation, people will have different ideas about how to get, for example, in the feminist movement, how to get better maternity pay for women, how to get more women into politics. There will be different conceptions about how you get from A to B, how you get that done. Secondly, in terms of international borders, because the very big consideration in social movements, as we talked about at the very beginning, is that they are not a monolith, which means they have lots of different areas in which they operate at very different stages. So if you're talking about getting the feminist movement getting some getting some gains and getting some improvement in Nigeria, that's very different to talk about how the gain it's going to get in Canada. These are very separate ideas because they're at very different stages of development and they're different cultures that revolve around women's rights. So, with that in mind, for example, there are conceptions around choice feminism. So, different nations and different individuals, let's say in the Western world, but more generally, have different conceptions of what it is to be a feminist. A choice feminist is someone who believes that women should have the right to choose whatever they want to do. So if a woman wants to, for example, be a housewife and stay at home, and that is what is going to empower her, the feminist movement behind choice feminism should say that is exactly what you should do, because staying at home and providing for your family is what empowers you and what makes you as an individual feel good. At the same time, we're very happy for someone else to say, I actually want to become a management consultant and go into business because that's what empowers me. Simultaneously, someone else can choose to become, let's say, and this is often a controversial one, if prostitution is what empowers you because that puts money and food on the table, then that is what you should do as a feminist because that is what ensures that you have the best access to feeding yourself, to then contributing to the movement. This is often a controversial feminism because it says that actually whatever women choose to do should be supported, whatever they do, almost blanket statement, which in certain countries, for example, becomes more difficult than others. So in countries with tight legislation that don't afford women the same rights as men, who often restrict their movement, their access, for example, Iran and Iraq at the moment, these are incredibly controversial because they're more likely and more liable to harm and risk. Instead, what the movement wants to stand for in other places, or more generally, is a more broad and general approach. And this is not choice feminism, it's just probably what you'd refer to as feminism generally. And it's the opposite of this, which is where you get conversations about, for example, pro-life, pro-choice. So the distinction here is that one says that you can do whatever you want and you can think whatever you want. So for example, using the example below, feminists can both be pro-life. Some of them can say, actually, you know what, I don't think it's fair to abort a baby at any point. Simultaneously, within that same umbrella, you can have feminists that are saying, actually, it's completely a woman's right to choose to abort at any point. Those are two diametrically opposed views. But under choice feminism, you can have both of them because whatever makes that individual happy, whatever they choose is valid. On the other hand, blanket feminism that says actually the feminist movement needs to adopt a pure and simple policy is the alternative. It says that you need consistency and you need an overarching view that everyone can unite behind. Notably, not everyone can unite behind it because presumably there are feminists who would like to be pro-life. So the important thing here is in the membership of the group, how exactly are you going to ensure that the feminist movement has represent its ideologies? How is it going to push through policy? These are considerations that you can make. And it's not, you don't have to choose one or the other, but just when you're debating, these are the nuances that you want to be thinking about, the specifics of how a movement operates, how its membership generally aligns itself. Does that make sense to everyone? Feel free to ask any questions at this point. Brilliant. Okay. Again, raise your hand at any point. What I'm very happy to ask. Notably, sorry, let's some parallels as well in the environmentalist movement, for example. Do you take a more radical or a less radical approach? So, for example, are you very pro just stop oil, standing in front of motorways, throwing orange paint on the Mona Lisa, on Da Vinci, harassing individuals, going onto Wimbledon tennis courts? Of course, they're not the prettiest ideas, but I know about them because they've come through the media because they're pretty landmark things to be doing. So again, do you support that kind of environmentalism that gets lots of people's attention but may anger them? Is all press good press? It's a phrase. Does it mean that any reporting is good reporting, even if it's saying this movement's bad? Or do you support a more pacifist environmentalism that says actually we'd much rather lobby traditionally, hold up signs outside Parliament, email MPs and hope that they support our agenda? Again, they are very valid, each of them. You just have to consider which of them makes it more likely for you to get policy changed. Okay, moving on then to leadership structures. So having talked about the membership, so the kind of aims and goals of them, let's think about the leadership structures. So firstly, the often controversial question is who should lead these social movements? Because theoretically, they stand behind literally all of the thing that they are encompassing. So environmentalism is all environmentalists around the globe. Feminism is all women who want to align with empowering women. BLM is all people who think that there is institutional and systematic racism within nations that needs to be addressed. So the question then is, among this huge, broad coalition of people, who should lead them? There are often two big concerns when we're talking about this. So, of course, when we were talking again earlier about the diversity within these social movements, it's important to note that within them, there's often what we consider minority and majority members. So if you think instinctively or intuitively about a majority member, someone, i.e., who's going to encompass, let's say, the most people in the US, the UK, Canada, Germany, whatever, it's like probably people who have more access to wealth and power because they're systematically able to have the time to be a feminist or to support the BLM movement. Of course, this is different for BLM when that's a specific one about race. But in these general movements, there's often people with slightly more power and time. They often, through just systematic, through institutional systems, happen to be white. So the leader of the feminist movement has been, I think, for the last 20 years. Versus what we call privileged minorities. So people who may have slightly different aims. So like Black women in America, for example, you'd think would have similar aims in the feminist movement. In New York, one of the most liberal states in America, a Black woman is 9 times more likely to die in childbirth than a white woman. That figure goes down to 0, so she is 0 times more likely to die if she's been treated by a Black doctor. So what this tells you is that there are still very, very prominent issues for, let's say, women of color in the US that would not affect a white woman, yet often the leadership is tended towards majority members. So there's a question that should be raised: how should that organization be run? So in theory, for example, by having a majority member who should have access to more structures and more capital to raise money, more connections to influence politics, maybe that's good. But does it matter if they're pushing through policy that actually doesn't advantage, let's say, Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups? Does it matter if in reality the policy they're pushing through only helps people above the poverty line who are actually already pretty okay anyways? So it's a question of, when people are leading these groups, what are they likely to be pushing through? And in more general terms, you don't need to get down to the nitty-gritty in debates. You can just say, okay, who is leading this group? What are they likely to believe? Who are these kinds of people likely to look like? What are their backgrounds? What agendas do they think of when they think of feminism or the environmentalist movement? The parallel for the environmentalist movement very quickly is, for example, in countries such as the Philippines, you can physically feel the effects of climate change, i.e. there are much less fish. Ocean acidification means that by about 2050, there's a decent chance 2 trillion fish are going to die, worrying. And the Philippines, for example, huge fishing community relies on that to live. So if ocean acidification gets bad, they will lose their food source, their income likely to get a lot worse. You can think about people actually dying there. That's a privileged minority. Not a lot of people relative to the entire group, but very important. Versus, let's say, the majority members, like the US and UK Just Stop Oil protesters, who get more airtime, are considered much more influential and powerful. Why should they be valued above the Filipino fisherman who now doesn't have access to food? So these are just different groups you can think about where the movement extends to, how it affects. The last question just to throw in there is kind of, what kind of structure should it be? Should we have leaders? Should there be a completely democratic system, sort of like the UN General Assembly, where everyone has a vote and it's all hunky-dory? Again, it's unclear. There's no right answer to these questions. It's just when you're thinking about social movements and someone makes a claim, for example, that says, actually, the feminist movement is now stronger because the leaders of it are far more able to push through policy because they're specifically, they're one figure that can talk to politicians and it's not too confusing. You can stand up and question, should there be leaders? Are these people able to actually represent the views of who they're meant to be representing? What are they likely to look like? Who is most likely to get into power? And so this is basically the idea of horizontal versus vertical structures. Do you want lateral power? So do you want lots of people to have a bit of power, or do you want a small number of people to have lots of power to govern? vertically, if that makes sense. So it's like, think about it in terms of a pressure point. Do you have one person essentially, or multiple at the top who are very powerful, making decisions for a lot of people below them, or do you have lots of people spread out who have lots of power between them, but individually not so much? So that's leadership structures. Yes, please, Stefano. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, could you just, I was, it was kind of a little confusing. Could you just clarify, what a privileged minority would be versus a majority member or leader? Like,
Of course.
yeah, sorry, could you just clarify that again?
Of course. So this varies from social movement. That's why it's a bit confusing. Still is for me, don't worry. So basically within each social movement, there's often groups that are more powerful and have more access to, let's say, like money and wealth than less so. So for example, in something like the environmentalist movement, a privileged minority is someone who doesn't have access to the same power as someone, let's say, in the Western world. So you can make like a developed versus developing distinction. So Filipino fishermen or Kenyan farmers versus the working man or woman in Germany, in Italy, in the UK. So these are people there's much less of them, but they're important people to consider. Versus majority members who are the vast majority of people, like there's a much bigger population between the US, Canada, and the UK of the kind of like the average stereotypical person than there is of a Filipino farmer. For example, the feminist movement, it's the same thing. It's saying that the majority of people in the Western world, for example, are likely to be white middle-class women, right? That's the kind of, you're taking the averages of things versus the Black woman in New York versus the Mexican woman, Hispanic and ethnic minorities often need to be considered here. So and then the other one is wealth. So it's talking about, let's say, let's go over to what movement should we do? Yeah, we can just stay in the feminist movement. Again, wealth. Is the person of middle income? Are they below the poverty line? Below the poverty line, again, there's less of them, but they're important because they're vulnerable, so they're a privileged minority. Majority members, those are people there's more of them, they have more access to capital and wealth, and often more systems of power. So it's all it's doing, and it sounds complicated, privileged minority, majority members. All it's saying is there's complexity within the membership. Some people have more rights than others. There are more of some people than there are other people, which means that when you're considering them in debates, if someone's only talking about how the businesswoman in Ohio gets more access to maternity pay, you can stand up and say, but look at the privileged minority members. How is this likely to affect someone living in Harlem who has very little access to a job anyway? This doesn't benefit them. They need simple access to the ability to vote. So it's just about those complexities within structures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
Just about? Yeah, okay. If you want to talk about it more, let me know. If it makes sense generally for everyone, I'll move on. But if it doesn't, so please, I can make it simpler. Sorry, it's not the simplest distinction. But yeah, just there's complexity within the issues. When you're thinking about these in debates, that's all you should be noting. Okay. Lastly, and more generally, what strategies should movements choose? So we've covered the membership more generally. That is to say that not all people agree. What kind of goals and activities should these movements try and choose? So, for example, we talk about choice feminism, pro-life versus pro-choice. What kind of strategies should they take? Radical, not radical. Then we did the leadership structure. That's to say, who should be leading, who are the people within these movements who need to be represented, so minority versus majority, and now how should they do this? So again, that first one there is ideological purity versus efficacy. Sounds complicated, it's very simple. Should a movement have one or two key beliefs that everyone holds, so it's very consistent in what it thinks? So for example, like not even a social movement, if we as a debating group unilaterally just say we support that everyone over the age of 8 should debate. That's our rule. We think that's what everyone thinks. That's what our policy is. Versus if each individual here were to say, actually, we have different ages that we support. We have different people that we think, different ages that we think people should start debating at. That is very valid because we each have our own opinion. But you have to weigh that up, so you have to balance it against efficacy, which basically means efficacy is likelihood of something happening, the probability that it will go through, the the probability of success, as it were. So should a movement such as the Black Lives Matter movement say full stop, we do not support racial profiling in the police force. For a while, this was a debatable topic. It's no longer anymore because racial profiling is horrible. But in 2011, I think it was a WSDC, so World Schools Debating Championship semis. So ideological purity, should there be a blanket policy that everyone believes and that's what the movement consistently thinks, or should, by contrast, you should have individual thoughts and individual perspectives proliferating, being voiced? Should 100 people show up to a rally and hold different signs? Should they hold one general sign? This is the kind of idea that you're thinking about. There is no, again, right answer to this. It's just how you envision it panning out. Do you think that in a rally, people are more likely to get, so in a protest, are they more likely to get success if they have one big message or lots of little ones? Versus in policy making, is it better to have one big thing or lots of actually tailored individual things that to specific parts of the law? Again, these are very different contexts where they probably make sense in different ways, but it's just important to hold them in your mind. Should a movement have general principles that stands behind? Should it have individual choice things that it does? Secondly, then, on action. So radical action is a hugely debatable topic in social movements because society is not very well equipped to deal with when people start protesting. China is a fantastic example of what's happened recently. Protest with COVID. Tsinghua University, Beijing's biggest university, sent home all of its students because of protests. And then when they returned every single COVID regulation that they'd previously had, they were getting tested every other day, I believe. Every single COVID regulation was gone. So again, radical action such as protesting works. They protested against it. It went, sent everyone home. That was radical. And then they came back and it was done. It was sorted. Doesn't always work. Just Stop Oil, great example, radical action. The questions behind it, so when you're talking about social movements, whether they should do radical action or not, think about these questions. So is it necessary? Is it justified? Does it provide them with leverage or a bargaining tool? So the first one, necessary. Do you need to be radical in a movement? And the line that you'll often hear used, if you want to debate it or if you want to debate against it, is it is necessary because the status quo is not good enough. The status quo is the present. And what it's saying is, if we continue on this path of not being radical, nothing will happen. As we've seen with environmentalism, literally nothing happened for about 20 years. That's because people are lazy, people don't want to change the system, it takes money, it takes time. So it's necessary to basically give them a kick and say, no, this is necessary, we're going to be radical in the way that we do this. Secondly, is it justified? Can you say that blocking up a motorway and potentially stopping ambulances from getting to hospitals to protect patients from dying, is that justified if you get more media attention to help the environmental movement? Can you really say that that is fair? Can you say, for example, that going out and protesting and let's say firebombing police stations in southern Massachusetts is fair just because they are treating, let's say, racial minorities badly? There's no right answer. Personally, I think definitely justified, but these are questions that you need to be considering. Is it justified? Is this worth the radical thing they're doing? Lastly, in that question, is it justified? You have a question of bargaining. That is to say, does this provide them with a greater ability to change things? Because let's go back to our very basics here. We know these are minority movements. We know they're trying to change people's mind. Are you able to do that if you're pissing them off? By contrast, are you able to do that if you're stopping the country from functioning effectively? So one that's often talked about is, for example, if Just Stop Oil protesters stopped doing things in the public domain and started bombing factories that, they started pipe bombing, for example, factories that were producing lots of CO2 emissions. If they started like physically like graffitiing, for example, BP oil stations in the UK, if they started like vandalizing and stopping these organizations from existing, that harm is potentially more than enough to stop these organizations doing it, because it's no longer worth it for them to keep doing it. So very simple example, why should I as BP keep running a factory that hurts the environment by CO2 emissions if it keeps getting blown up every 2 months because people disagree with it and I keep having to rebuild it, right? That is a bargaining tool, but it could piss them off, could make them dig their heels in, do worse. So that is the classic example, Extinction Rebellion. Should you be doing drastic things to save the environment? Should you be doing more moderate things? There is no right answer, as there is with social movements. If there's a right answer, everyone would have chosen it by now. There isn't. But there is the distinctions within how this works. And what you can try and apply, and I know it's a lot to hold in your mind, but just wrapping up, what you can try and apply is where would different strategies work in different contexts? For example, would a strategy of ideological purity work better in membership? So going back to that first one that we chose, would it work better in membership where, oh, there we go. Anyway, we'll just set it outside. My computer's being weird. Anyway, would it work? But for example, would it work better for membership to might go away? There we go. Would it work better in certain contexts to have ideological purity where membership is much scarcer? So if you're talking about Qatar, is it better for women to have ideological purity in feminism? That means that they all believe roughly the same thing in order for them to get change, because they need a basic standard of life. So they need basic rights that they should generally agree on. Versus, is choice feminism make more sense in the more Western world, such as the US, where there's more liberalism attached to feminism, where they already have a much more of a degree of rights. So what that's doing is they're saying there are certain strategies that you have that you can then apply in certain situations. Slightly more complex, but all you should be thinking about throughout this is social movements are not one big thing. There are many different things. You can talk about many different aspects of them. So let's deal with the key takeaways. The aim of these social movements is to be accepted by society and politicians. They want to change your mind. So each and every one of you, if I stood up today and talked about one specific social movement, my aim would have been that you treated certain people differently, acted in a different way, thought different things, and they are trying to change the laws and the structures within society that treat people in a certain way or ideas in a certain way. They're trying to ensure that good environmental protection laws are enlisted. They're trying to ensure that women have the same pay as men. They're trying to ensure that black women in the US have the exact same chance of walking down the street without getting harassed as you and I. So that's one of their aims. Secondly, they are often prioritized in debates because they are vulnerable groups. We've talked about how they're marginalized, how they want to redistribute systems of wealth and power, how they want greater access to rights. All of these necessitate that they come from a place of less access to rights, that they come from a place of less access to systems of wealth and power because they are marginalized. So if in a debate, and it's only, note very keyly, note in a very key way, they should only be brought in when it makes sense. So social movements are things that are very important in many debates. But if, for example, you're talking about a debate about this house would privatize with the healthcare system or nationalize a healthcare system in a given country, doesn't probably make sense to be talking about BLM or feminism in that. If you get a debate that says this house would introduce quotas, so a fixed number of people to go into a certain sector, this house would introduce quotas for parliament. In that situation, yes, probably makes sense to talk about quotas for women in parliament. Then yes, probably makes sense to talk about feminism, the different groups in there. But they should often then be prioritized because they are vulnerable. You have to explain that they are in a position weakness, they're often given less rights, thus we should afford them more rights, care about them more. That's our impacting that we've been talking about earlier. You're impacting them as a group, you're saying why I as a judge should care about them. Thirdly, social movements are diverse in their aims and their methods. They have different membership, they have different structures, they have different leadership. So membership, leadership, and organization or beliefs and goals. So very important to think they're not just one thing, they're lots of different things. And fourthly and finally, they're highly controversial, A, in their structure, but B, in their general existence. So you have to be very sensitive when you're talking about them, because these are often issues that are very prevalent and step on the toes of historical biases, historical discrimination and oppression, modern day segregation and discrimination. So when you're talking about social movements, you should often handle them with a lot of care. Try not to make broad generalizations. Try not to make big comments that are not supported by analysis and evidence. you'll often run into problems there. Your best bet is thinking about what an individual on the ground would look like, what the reality of that is, and then going from there. That's the end of the lecture. They are very big and very controversial topics as outlined, so there's no need to try and get your head around every single last bit of it. What this is meant to do is just give you a broad structure about how and why they exist, what they're trying to do. If there are no questions, we'll move on to the debate, but please do ask if you have anything generally about the topic or more specifically any elements of this lecture. I'll wait a few seconds. Yeah, Stefano.
So I guess in a debate or even in your everyday life, when it comes down to you have to talk about a social movement, how would you recommend or how would you say you should, I mean, I guess you sort of touched on this, but I mean, how do you get comfortable with talking about these kinds of things when even when you think you know what the movement is about, it contains all these nuances like you just described, to the point where you feel like you're stepping through a minefield, and like if you misword something, it becomes a blanket statement, or it just becomes untrue.
That's a great question. So in broad strokes, there are things that you can say that there are broad comments. So there are two things. One is that you can make some broad comments. So for example, about BLM, you know for a fact that what they want to do is advance the treatment of African Americans in the US and more globally. So you can say that, for example, if you're talking about it in general discussion or debate, you can say that is one of their aims. That's their primary aim, is to improve the treatment of African Americans in the US. Then, so the second way of ensuring that you don't step on a political landmine is by just acknowledging or holding different things in your mind. So often terminology in debates, but even everyday languages, they have a number of ways of doing this, or there are many pathways that we think BLM are likely to take in order to achieve this. Similarly, if you find yourself in an environmentalist conference for any reason, environmentalism, very key. You generally agree on the broad aims. You want people to stop using plastic. You want them to save the environment. In terms of how they achieve that and their structure, there's a number of ways you can do it. We say that it's very fine, that there are some that are far more radical, that take radical approaches. They can be violent. Maybe we support that in a debate, maybe we don't, but we acknowledge it. By contrast, there are some that are much more pacifist, again, depending on whether or not you want to argue for that in a debate or not. So that's the key difference between debate and life, which is that in a debate, what you can do is omit certain views. You can say that one of the ways of doing this is X. So you've just said that there are many ways, basically. You don't have to point them out. You don't have to say these are all different versions of feminism. But you can say, for example, a prominent theory in feminism is choice feminism. Why does this get better on our side of the house? So you've identified one of the groups. So in debating, all it's allowing you to do, all the complexity and the nuance here, is allowing you to talk about these issues in a specific way that helps your case. Because if you try and fit the feminist movement into a debate, generally, it'll be very difficult. If you try and fit ideological purity, so thinking one consistent thing into a debate, that's a lot easier. So trying to answer your question, there are certain things that you can just say because they are true and because they make sense. And those are, if you don't think 100% that something is true and agreed upon, generally I'd leave it out. But there are some things I think you'll probably have a handle on that are just valid. And then in debates and in life generally, it's very okay to take a standpoint and say, I know that there are many things that exist within this, but I think one specific thing. I know for a fact that environmentalism is hugely controversial, and there's no distinct way of outlining exactly which one's best. However, what we can see in countries like the UK, what we can see in countries like Eastern Europe, there's far greater progression in terms of knowledge when there is radical movements that get in the news. This is because this means that this happens. This is good because, therefore, it's important. And then you follow the same train of argument as you normally do. You've proved why something is true. So as long as there's analysis, you're fine. You've proved it's true. You've proved it's good. Then you're much less liable to getting accused of anything, like not knowing what you're talking about, etc. So yeah, make some statements, hold the nuance in your mind, make sure you have analysis to support it, and you should be all fine in debates and in life generally.